With our open forum, and in this section we're going to be looking at what are the major issues facing youth in the church. And we're going to open this with how can the church help parents be more effective in building faith in their children. And we'll pick up with Randy Duke on that.
Wow, I had the answer because I thought it said, how can we help parents be more effective, not how can the church help parents? I can help parents. I don't know how the church can help parents. I tell you, one thing that we've done where we are, whether it's right or it's wrong, I don't know, but we have about 150 kids on Wednesday night in what would be classified as the youth group. Imagine that. One thing that we've done that's helped encourage those kids is that we've encouraged parents and adults to be involved in teaching them and in being part of the youth group. And what I mean by that is that we'll get parents and adults, obviously, to teach classes, but they'll be involved in outings and activities that maybe they do together, building relationship with the kids. One thing that we did was interesting is we had our young people write letters to older members of the congregation to get to know them. And when the older members got their letters and read them, they were invited to get with the young person who wrote that letter and spend some time with them. And it was interesting that they developed relationships, and they would attend services in the same building but maybe never cross paths if that hadn't happened. One of the key things that I think you can do, and this is just from my perspective, do not isolate your young people in service. Do not do activities that are strictly for we're going to allow the youth group to get together to do a service project. That's fine. I'm not up here advocating against that. But encourage your young people to do things with the congregation and integrate them in the congregation. One thing that's kind of a dying thing is the concept of door knocking. And whether you're for it or against it, you say, well, it's not effective in these times. The world's too violent. We can't go door knocking. I'm not advocating again for it or against it. But one thing that we've done when we've had door knocking campaigns, it really builds relationships across different generational bands. So that we've got a 65-year-old door knocking with a 16-year-old. And it's funny when you come back to the building and you turn in your cards, these 16-year-old and 65-year-old are huddled up over here talking to two more people and say, oh, well, we went by so-and-so's house and you'll never believe. And they're telling war stories about door knocking. And it's absolutely wonderful because now that 16-year-old has got a buddy for life that's 65 years old and sits across on the other side of the congregation that they hardly ever see. And now they've formed a relationship. And that's where I believe it's a misnomer when we say that the young people are the church of tomorrow, because the young people are the church of today. They need to get busy and they need to be working in the Lord's church. How are they going to learn that unless we teach them? They can't learn that being isolated in a youth group and somebody telling them, you need to get busy for the Lord. You need to show them how to get busy for the Lord and make relationships. life is about relationships. And as we make those relationships, that's the only thing that we take with us when we leave this world. And so it's important that the young people start to learn those lessons where they are today.
The first thing that comes to mind for me when I think about this question, I was regaining my thoughts, is that as much as we realize that parents have a duty to their children, that's not the question. The church is, how can the church help the parents be more effective? One way the church, I believe, can help the parents be more effective in building the faith of their children, the church has, if the children are coming to Bible classes on a regular basis, we have a couple hours per week. If they're there Sundays and Wednesdays, we have a couple hours per week with these young children. What are we doing with that time? What are we doing with the Bible class time that's right there for us? I mean, parents drop their kids off and say, teach my child the Bible. What are we doing with that time? Are we making the most of it? Is the curriculum up to par? Or is it something really just to fill some time with these children? Who are our Bible class teachers? Do the elders know them? Are the elders regularly sitting in on the Bible classes and seeing what's being taught to our children? I realize elders have a lot on their plate, but also realize that there's a lot of seeds for false doctrine that can germinate in the classroom of the young people. And that germination, that growth will be full-blown by the time those children are older. And sometimes we're surprised at some things if we sit in and hear our children tell us later, or somehow we find out what's being taught in those Bible classes that are strictly for the children. And again, going back to Randy Duke, that's why it's so important that parents are involved in all aspects, even to the Bible classes. There's nothing wrong with a parent going into the Bible class of a child and sitting there and making sure those things are being taught the way they should be taught. But how do you know things are being taught the way they should be taught? Well, as the parent, you have to know your Bible as well. And so just some thoughts thinking about how important our education, we might call it the education program, is for a congregation. Are we making sure that the time we have with the children is being used in the best way possible, the best way we know how?
I look at this question and I break it down in two areas. The first part of the question, how can the church help the parents? For a parent to build faith in a child, the parent's got to have faith herself. And I think about, this seemingly preceding idea that churches are becoming Sunday morning only. I think you all understand what I'm talking about. The faithfulness is depicted on the amount of time that we're together on a Sunday morning. Well, we can't miss Sunday morning, but we can miss Sunday night and we can miss Wednesday. Today, for an example, a prime opportunity to be together. I don't see many teenagers here. Maybe a couple that I've seen the whole day that we're here. The last part of the question talks about building faith in their children. How does a church help parents? Well, I think the church first off has to help the parents realize the importance of their level of faithfulness. Somebody, I think it was you, that said, what you get here, you're going to get here. And that's, a lot of that is right. Statistics back up the idea that, when one parent is faithful, there's a certain percentage that the kids are going to grow up to be faithful. When both are faithful and active in the church, that percentage goes way up. And if we as parents really are interested in making sure that our children remain faithful into adulthood and become productive members of the Lord's church, they've got to see that in us as parents. And I'm not really sure that we see that level. Everybody wants their kids to go to heaven, right? There's not one of you in here that has kids or grandkids that you don't want them to go to heaven. But as a parent, I was one of those kids that I called those church-drugged kids. Okay? I was drugged everywhere. When there was a meeting, I was drugged there. When there was a lectureship, I was drugged there. And when I was, 12 or 13 years old, I would sit back there where you're sitting like I did today, and I'd sit and I'd think, those stuffed shirt preachers. They think they know everything. They don't know what's going on in my mind. And the more my dad drugged me to those things, I didn't realize at the time what he was doing, but he was filling my mind with things that you might not think I was getting, but it was soaking into my mind. It was soaking into my brain, that he was instilling in me the importance of being around faithful Christians, hearing faith-based lessons, and that it was important. It wasn't an option in my house growing up. That Sunday night and Wednesday night, you didn't go to church. Today, a parent, you would tell a parent that and they say, oh, I just can't be that mean to my child. You know, I can't make them go to Sunday night and Wednesday night. I can't make them go to youth group. Well, brother, let me tell you something. If you don't make sure they're going to those things, the devil will make sure they're getting a part of everything else that's out in the world. And that's just fact. That's just fact of the matter. So the church needs to do maybe a better job in instilling into our parents that their kids will get a certain part of their faith from them. And sometimes looking in the mirror at our faith and our commitment to our children, you know, might be the answer to a lot of that.
Something Freddie had mentioned is what kind of curriculum is being used with our young people. I do want to highlight that some congregations use the Horizon curriculum with the teens and then the Foundations of Faith with the adults because they follow the same sequence. And they use that to encourage parents and teenagers to discuss these matters in the course of the week, whatever the Bible class happened to have been on in that time. Moving on, the question is, how do we equip youth to live in an increasingly secular society? Todd will pick up with you.
Well, I think that's a challenge for all of us. I think as adults and with our children as well. We live in a society today where you know, things are always changing. Things of importance seem to always change. You know, we are, in just a moment in our 4 o'clock in our last closing session, we'll talk about, you know, spiritual maturity and God's pattern for spiritual maturity. You know, when we think about spiritual maturity, we instantly automatically go to adults and look at their level of spiritual maturity and talk about that. I think at the same time in equipping our youth to live in this society is what are we doing in our churches to make sure they are maturing spiritually. I know some teenagers who are far more spiritually mature than some adults that I know. And in our work in the church, you know, when we get up to preach, those of us that preach on a regular basis, you know, it's okay to include our youth in those sermons. It's okay to address things to them. Not only should we, you know, teach and to get adults to understand the importance of living a Christian life, being dedicated, growing spiritually, our teenagers need to hear that as well. You know, when I was a teenager, I always wanted to feel like that what I had to say was important in the youth group or even in the church. And our eldership, when I was 17 and 18 years old, you know, you'd have congregation, they'd have meetings with deacons and the preachers, and they'd have congregational meetings. Our eldership had meetings with the teens to make us feel, and I think they meant it, to make us feel like we were important to that congregation. And that what our thoughts and our opinions and what direction that we wanted to go, that we felt like we needed for spiritual growth, they were tuned into that. Because they took the time out of their schedule to call a meeting with the teens. And I appreciated that so very, very much. I don't know that I see that much anymore. And to help our kids, you know, be able to have that balance of the church and the world, you know, the worst thing you can do is exclude a young person. And I think, you know, we've already heard that mentioned up here, is to exclude a young person to the point to where they feel like they don't care whether I'm there or not. What about your church? Do they feel like that it matters when they're there and that they play an important part? And I'll amen the thought that was given a moment ago. Our kids are not the church of tomorrow. Our kids are the church of the day. Because if they're not here today, there's not going to be a church tomorrow. What heritage are we leaving them?
I can't help but think of this question in light of me being a parent myself. I taught a Bible class recently on 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21, and I asked a question, and I asked you this question as well. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you living the way you're living? Why do you worship the way that you worship? Right? This question can be posed in various ways, but as it pertains to the question that we have today, think about as a parent, think about as a Bible class teacher, think about as a preacher, think about as a member of a congregation. Are we asking our youth, are we constantly challenging them to question why they are doing what they're doing? This is very important. We live in a culture that is highly secularized. But think about the time of the divided kingdom, and think about the kings and the way that the successive kings came up, and they came up in highly secularized societies. And yet there are some that came out of the worst of those society and reigned as good kings. Think about how we're raising our youth as a congregation, right? You say, well, I'm not a parent directly, but you're still helping these children. Again, if we believe what has been said, that these children are not just the future, but they are the church today, well, how are we helping them? Well, part of that is that we're helping them understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. Why are they worshiping God the way that they're worshiping? Why are they living the way that they're living? Why are they here on Sunday when they could be somewhere else? So I think part of it is, we could fight all the battles of talking about all the different things that are going wrong in the world, or we can show them all the things that are right and how they should be living in a right manner. My young son, Waylon, often asks and points out different things that we've talked about along the way. And so I think it's very important that we're developing conversations with our young people. Not just a hi, how you doing, how's your week been, but developing deeper relationships with them and helping them to understand challenges maybe that they're going through in their lives. Asking them questions about what's going on in their life to help them share your wisdom on the things that have been happening maybe you faced before as they're growing up, maybe to help them as well.
One thing Freddie mentioned, I think I'd like to piggyback on, is challenging our young people to question. And I'm not talking about challenging our young people to chase rabbits, okay? Challenge our young people to question why they believe what they believe. I'll give you for instance. If you talk to a young person about music, let's say, and you ask them, who's your favorite band? They'll list off 2 or 3. Well, why do you like them? Oh, I remember the first time I ever heard them, I was doing this, and they discovered this band on their own, and it became their band. When they discover their faith, whether it's faith that's been passed down from generation to generation, or they're just becoming Christians, when their faith becomes their faith, it's important to them. It becomes a priority to them. We teach our young people. The question is, how do we equip youth to live in an increasingly secular society? We teach them to live in society just like we teach them to live and function in society. We can't shelter our children from the world forever. So we have to teach them. It's no different than having a toddler and you go around and you put locks on everything in your house and you move everything up to 4 feet high. Or you can tell them no and teach them. You don't touch this because it hurts. You don't drink that because it's bad for you. The same thing we do spiritually. We teach our young people what's good for them, what God approves of, and what's not good for them. God doesn't give us a set of rule books because he wants us to complete a checklist. He's given us the Bible so that if we follow what he has given us, we live a full, faithful, and complete life, not only in this world, but the world that comes after. It's for our best interest, and we need to share that with our young people and let that become part of their faith and who they are. And I'm a firm believer that when they adopt their faith, and their faith comes from something tangible, they'll show that tangible faith, and it becomes theirs, and they won't let it go. You know, we also need to tell our young people that if they stand up for God, they may not be popular. You know, Jesus talks in is it John 15, where he's talking to his disciples, 14, 15, 16. You know, the world hated me, they're going to hate you. And I know in that context he's talking to his apostles there. But the principle's the same. You cannot serve two masters. And our young people need to realize, you know, at some point you make that decision. And you have to serve the Lord or not. And when they're faced with that time, they have to own that. And as parents, you know, you want to protect your children as long as you can. Mine are 25 and about to be 24, and I want to protect them still. They're both grown and married, and I still want to protect them. But hopefully, I gave them the tools that they needed spiritually to look to God to protect them and put their faith and trust in Him.
Our next question, how can we promote actual human relationships in a society obsessed by electronic social media? And bear in mind, you are being live streamed. Ready?
Okay. First thing I might say about this is that, again, we have to be leading by example. If we want our children and the youth and others not to be obsessed with social media and have actual relationships, then we ourselves can't be those people that are obsessed with social media. It seems like it would make sense, right? But sometimes we say, do as I say, not as I do. Right? We're living in a way that maybe is contradictory to the way that we're teaching. And so it's very important. It's easy to get sucked into things like Facebook and Twitter and things like that. But I touched on this earlier in this open forum. I'd say my generation and younger, maybe older, I don't know, I can't speak for them. But my generation specifically is a generation of me. Me. And what happens with this me mindset, this selfish mindset, is it said, we're obsessed with this, with social media. In part because, as studies have shown, we get this rush when someone likes a post that we share. We get this rush when someone comments on something that we might have shared as well. Or someone shares our status maybe. So we get this rush, and it's all about me. And so every time my phone goes off, it dings. I want to look at it. I want to know what's going on there because of the rush, the feel I get. But you know, there's some other things in this life that cannot be reproduced by social media. There are things like individual relationships that cannot be reproduced by social media. And so I want us, as a congregation, as people that care about our youth and about the congregation, maybe it's not just the youth, but to help foster these types of things. Randy brought it up earlier, and I love door knocking. I think it's great. You know what people don't do while they're door knocking? They can't spend time on their phones because you're either at a door getting rejected or you're going to the next house trying to knock and tell somebody else about what you have to tell them about. Tell them about the gospel. Tell them about what programs you got going on. And so by keeping individuals busy, not just busy work, but actually keeping our hand to the plow, we have less tendency to be me-focused, inward-focused, and more thinking about how can I help serve others? How can I be outward focused? How can I be thinking about other people? And helping somewhat to try to stem, try to alleviate this culture of always thinking about me, 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 me. How about we help others think about others more?
Social media. I think instead of trying to come up with ways to keep them off of it, I think we need to embrace social media. I remember when Facebook first came out, it was a teenage thing. And then when my children found out that Dad created a Facebook, my oldest daughter said, "Well, that's just weird." And teenagers, if you watch, have now transitioned away from Facebook, and they create Twitter. And then when adults figured out they could do Twitter too, then they moved to Snapchat. So I don't know if anything has come after Snapchat. Have I lost one somewhere? I'm sure there is. Instagram, yes. So see, as we keep following them, they just keep pushing to come to another level of social media. Now, I understand social media is, I was in a restaurant the other day, and I looked over and there was a family sitting over at a table, and there were 5 of them, and all 5 of them had a phone. And all 5 of them were doing this. And just when I got ready to turn to my wife and one of my youngest daughter, who's 22, when I started to turn to her and say, "Look how bad that is," I looked, and there sat my wife, and there sat my daughter doing that. Social media is not a bad thing. It's like anything else that's come along. Yes, there are people who will abuse social media. There are those deviants, sexual deviants that are out there who use that to try to work their advantage to molest or put themselves in a situation to abuse a child. But there's good that can come from social media. And I think you would say, with the Gospel Advocate, you use social media. I know this congregation, Fishinger and Kenny, uses social media. Our congregation in Centerville, we rely heavily on social media. I mean, every day at our congregation, one of our elders, or all of our elders and both of our ministers, we write an article every day that's published on Facebook. So it's a avenue, and it's an area that we've got to learn to embrace. And we've got to learn to have a balance. How about this? When you get together as a family and your kids, and my kids are about the same age as yours. I've got 26, 24, and 22. When we get together for a holiday dinner, it's about the only time we get together anymore, the phones go in a basket for a while, so that we can have some time to talk to each other and find out what's going on in their world versus them sending it to me in a text. 2 weeks ago, I'm upstairs in the bedroom, and my wife is in the basement. And I don't know what she was doing, and I don't know what I was doing, but it wasn't busy, and it wasn't important. I get a text from my wife in the same house. I go running through the bedroom door, I go running to the basement, and I go, "Seriously? We're in the same house and you're going to text me?" So social media and communication avenue, it's there. I think it can be a very important tool. Parents, let me give you a warning from one who has counseled many a teen and many sets of parents. Though social media can be a good thing, if you are not checking on what your kids are doing in the computer and in the social media age, you need to get your head out of the sand. Because though it can be good, it can be very harmful. And please don't think, "Oh, they'll do what's right." How many of you would give a stick of dynamite and a lighter to a 3-year-old, knowing they would say they would do the right thing? You know what they're going to do? They're going to keep clicking until they light it because they've seen a cartoon character do it. And it's the same thing with watching them in the social media world. You're not going to get them away from it. Unless phones just crash and you throw them away, you're not going to get them away from it. So let's learn how to embrace it. Let's learn how to use it in a positive way. Let's turn it into something that can be very spiritual in nature to help them grow, but also to help them to kind of set an example for those that they're dealing with that are using the same social media that they use.
I agree. I mean, it's a tool like anything else. You know, chainsaw helps you cut wood, but it also cuts your leg off. You know, so you have to know how to use the tool. Teach them how to do that. Well, one thing we did a couple of years ago is we tried to embrace technology and use it. At Mount Juliet, we did a door knocking campaign right there in our own community, and we called it 12 Questions. And we basically use social media and the internet and advertising to say, if you could ask God one question, what would that question be? We threw that up in different places, and we even rented a space at the local theater before the movie and shot it up there. If you could ask God one question, what would it be? And then put the website address up there so that they could go there and answer their question. Then we took the questions and we boiled all the questions down into 12 questions, and then we had a 4-night gospel meeting on those 12 questions. And we invited the community that asked those questions. You've asked, now come see what the Bible says about these 12 questions. And so we tried to use it as a tool for positive. But you can, just like anything else, it can be abused. And I totally agree with what Todd said. You got to know what's out there. You got to know what they're doing, and you've got to monitor it and use it appropriately, like you would any tool.
Our final question, and this dovetails into some of the things we covered in some of the earlier sessions. When teens are struggling with where they fit into cultural gender roles, how can we encourage them to embrace biblical gender roles rather than turn to the LGBTQ agenda? And then there's clarification: to oversimplify, just because you are a boy in the South who doesn't like football doesn't mean you should question your gender identity. Randy, we'll start with you.
You know, I think we in this room are very familiar with what the Bible teaches about gender and sexual preference, et cetera, et cetera. The world may not have access to the same information that we do, or they may not know how to use that information. God's very plain on what He designed. Go back to Genesis chapter 1. God says, let me tell you who I am. I made everything. Chapter 2, He says, let me tell you who you are. You're a man and you're a woman, and I created you. And then chapter 3, He says, let me show you who your enemy is. We as a society today are still wrestling with Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. We need to understand what God teaches about who He is and His relationship with us and what He's created. God created man from dust. And now science has come to the point to realize that that man on the 23rd pair of chromosomes has 2 X's. God made woman. He took Adam, and from the rib of Adam, He made woman. And if you look at that woman's chromosomal pair in number 23, it's an X and a Y. You can dress it up any way you want to do it, but you can't change the fact that a male, has 2 X's, and a woman has an X and a Y. No, I got that backwards, didn't I? I was a biology major a long time ago, okay? Sorry. Male, XY, woman, XX. What man necessarily claims may not be true. What God claims is truth. John 17:17. The world may not understand that the way maybe I understand that. There are people in the world, and there are people, if you're not aware of this, you need to be aware of this. There are people in your own congregations who struggle with sexual identity. We have people in our congregation who will pull you aside and tell you, if you'll listen to them, I struggle with homosexuality. I have these tendencies. I have these desires. We need to be aware of that. We need to know how to address that. We need to know what God's Word says about those things and share that with them. Again, as David Shannon mentioned earlier, we need to share the truth in love. If a person is entangled in a sexual sin, whether it's homosexuality or adultery or whatever it might be, it's still a sin in God's eyes. It's no better or it's no worse. It's sin. So I know that is a question that congregations are dealing with. Again, that's one of those things that I don't think it really matters what part of the country you're in. You need to be dealing with it. I have very close ties to the church in Denver. Denver is a much more progressive area than many places that us here live in. That issue is very big there, but that issue is very big right where I live, in my own congregation. And so we need to be teaching people what God's Word says and what God has ordained.
Don't know that I could add a whole lot more to that. One thing I'll go from is that if every congregation that's represented here, I'd say it's safe to say that's been an issue that you've dealt with. 10 years ago you heard about it. Now you're experiencing it. I think what we have to be is, like with any biblical matter, is we have to teach what the Bible says. I think we have to be loving. I think we have to be patient. But I think we have to teach what the Bible says without question. Someone says, well, we've got a young person in our youth group that, is really struggling with identity, whether they're male or whether they're female. And you always hear that thing, well, I just don't know which way God made me. Well, God doesn't make junk. God doesn't make you to sin. And you've got to begin teaching them the value of who they are as an individual. Brother Shannon talked about, counterfeiters. They don't study the counterfeit bills. They study the real bills. They know exactly what a real bill looks like. You say, well, I do too. Do you really? Do you know every little detail? They do. And I think that we need to let our young people, our teenagers, know that, we can define who they are through the Bible and help them identify and to be able to deal with the things that they're dealing with. Because, they're going to get one thing at church, but when they go back to school, there are those who are going to support their idea 100%. And keep pushing them that way, and keep pushing them that way. So my main thing is we need to have our eyes open. Don't think that it's not going to happen in your congregation, because it will, and it probably already has. It's already been said, there are people in every congregation who struggle with sexual identity and sexual orientation. So let's keep our eyes open as leaders in the church, as families in the church, and let's be there ready to help them get through that struggle in their life.
Kind of going back to this question, I want us to think about something that maybe we do and we don't realize we do it. And I appreciate everything that's been said so far, and I want to touch on one thing that I don't feel like it's been fully fleshed out yet, and that is, I'll say something personally about me. Years ago, I was a vegan. What does that mean? Well, I didn't eat meat. I didn't eat any animal products, right? And Will can attest to this, right? Now, right. And let me say something. That's perfect. That's perfect that he did that, okay? Because when this talks about gender roles, can we sometimes subtly say, well, because you don't like football, you're not as much of a man as I am. Because you don't eat meat, you're not as much of a man as I am. And we say, well, whoa, that seems like you're making a mountain out of a molehill. But it doesn't. Think about this over and over and over. When we hear these things, maybe we say, well, I'm going to go to the far end of the spectrum and say, well, if I'm not accepted this way, then maybe I'm just not the typical role that everybody sees me as being. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So maybe I need to find a different role for myself altogether. Right? Maybe I need to go to this community that seems as if, or at least they play off of, well, we're accepting of everybody. So I just want to appeal to you. When people do things that are different, that don't go against, the Bible tells men act like men, right? Be a man. But there are many choices people can make in their life that doesn't make them any less of a man because they make those choices. Right? Mark Day talked a little bit earlier today. Binding where God has not bound. Right? Do we have a criteria for what a man is? And anything outside of that, we say, well, that's not really manly of you. Well, who are we to say that? That's an opinion about somebody who is or is not a man. What manliness is am I carrying out my role as being the leader of my home? Am I helping out in the worship assemblies? And am I preaching and teaching? Am I doing those things that men are supposed to do? Am I protecting my family? If I'm doing those things, I'm a man. And if I make other choices in my life that are not biblical choices, or if they're not biblically stipulated choices, that makes me no less of a man. Same for a woman. Maybe a woman, she enjoys working out. Does that make her any less of a woman because she enjoys doing that? Maybe someone would say, well, man, she has more muscles than me. Does that make her any less of a woman? Some things to think about, I guess. Do you want to second that? Or not second that?
Well, I'll tell you this. If you don't believe it's come to your congregation, you need to open your eyes. I have talked to people in my congregation who have said, I talked to a young man who said, I've lived the homosexual lifestyle. And he said, when I became a Christian, I realized that was wrong according to God. And I repented. But he said, every day that I live, I still live with those tendencies. So it's a constant struggle for this man to not act on the behavior that he feels. God knows his heart. All we as man can see is behavior. This man's behavior is in alignment with God, although his tendencies are going against what God teaches. You're talking about a struggle? That is a struggle. And for this young man, it's real. And we as the church need to be aware that that's here. And just like the alcoholic struggles with taking a drink, are they acting on that behavior? Are those in our congregations with homosexual tendencies, are they acting on those behaviors? How can we help anyone, whether it's a sexual sin, whether it's a sin of the heart, whether it's a sin of the tongue, whatever it might be? How do we become better at helping people do what God asks them to do and be what God asks them to be? Again, are we focusing on souls? Are we focusing on the things that are truly important to God?
I appreciate these men and the time that they've spent in sharing with us. I get to work with Todd on Fort Hill Christian Youth Camp and enjoy that association. Of course, Randy is my publisher, and I've come to really love Freddie. I was with his congregation on a campaign this last year, and when I came back to Ohio, I sent him a box of steaks, trying to convert him. We're going to take a break, and then we'll have our final session.